Okay, we will get started. And this week's Torah portion is Parshat Emor, and it's very appropriate because after some words talking about the priests and limitations on the priests, the Kohanim, and animals that are brought for sacrifices, we have a review of the holidays. And so this is uses the readings on the holiday. And so it begins in chapter 23 after it says, 6 days shall you do your work, and on the seventh day will be your Sabbath, holy sacred occasion, do no work. And these are the set times of the Lord, the sacred occasions. And it starts off with Passover. It says after that, you'll be okay. When you enter land, I am giving to you, and you reap its harvest. You shall bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. He shall elevate the sheaf before the Lord for acceptance on your behalf. The priest shall elevate it on the day after the Sabbath. Okay, so this is a reference to the Omer, the bringing of the Omer. We talked about this before. It's the Torah language is ambiguous because it says the day after the Sabbath. And as I mentioned in an earlier class, this gave rise to debate as to what day this was. Was it on Sunday, no matter what? Was this on Sunday after the holiday of Passover concluded? Or, as the rabbis understood it, it was on the second day of Passover, because the Sabbath is also used sometimes as a reference to the holidays. So, excuse me. And then it talks about what it is involved with. And from that day on, which you bring the sheaf of elevation offering, the day after the Sabbath, again, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. You must count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord. And then you will bring from your settlements 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering. Each shall be made of a measure of choice flour, and goes through the details of that. And then other sacrifices that take place. On that same day, you shall hold a celebration to be a sacred occasion for you. You shall not work at your occupations. This is a law for all time in all your settlements throughout the ages. So this is the reference to the holiday of Shavuot. Okay. Not called Shavuot here. The rabbis sometimes refer to as Atzeret, because in a sense, it was seen by the rabbis as the completion of Passover. As the rabbis say, what is the purpose of freedom unless you have a purpose? To have no kind of aim in life is not life as it should be led. So the giving of the Torah at Sinai, which the rabbis say is the 50th day after the beginning of counting the Omer, we receive the Torah and mitzvot, and thus you have the freedom, which now becomes freedom that is organized around the structure of how to lead your life. All right, and I'll come back to it in a minute, and then it goes on to talk about the other holidays of the year. It talks after it talks of the holidays. It talks about somebody blasphemes against God who was taken out and punished. And that's the end of Parshat Emor. Excuse me. Okay, I see China came in. All right. So now, Chag HaShavuot, the holiday of Shavuot. The name Shavuot comes from the idea of counting the weeks. 7 weeks, 7 Shavuot, the 50th day being the holiday. It's not really spelled out very well in the Torah. What I read to you about the observance is basically all we have there. But the way the rabbis saw the chronology of the Exodus, that meant that the 6th of Sivan, which is the day it falls on, was the day the Torah was given, and they have to count. They have to make sure that it all works out. That becomes the 50th day. Right? Now, just again, real quickly, as I alluded to, that was a subject of dispute. The Sadducees apparently had a different counting. We know that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are other writings that indicate that had different understandings of the mitzvah, but that is the way we have it, that we follow it. So the major observance of Shavuot, the historical idea behind it is the giving of Torah. It's also clearly an agricultural holiday. All the holidays, the major holidays, the 3 pilgrimage festivals are all related to the agricultural calendar. And as we're going to see when we read about the book of Ruth, it is at the end of the barley and wheat harvest season. When Shavuot falls. It falls at the time when the land is drying up. The rains don't usually fall in the land of Israel during the summer months. So that's the end of the big growing, although certain aspects of growing will continue until the fall harvest. But the cereal grains, oats and barley and wheat, are usually harvested there at that point. But we really emphasize it with the idea of giving of the Torah, which again is not spelled out. It doesn't spell out exactly what that relationship between the holiday of Shavuot and the giving of the Torah was, but the rabbis line it up. So it becomes that night, the first night of the holiday, was the night you're waiting before you're going to get the Torah. 3 days before you're supposed to be preparing for the giving of the Torah. It was a time of purification. Everybody was looking forward to the giving of the Torah the next morning. And a famous midrash, which doesn't seem to have much support in the Bible, but is that the Israelites slept late. I don't know why they ended up sleeping late that day when they were supposed to get the Torah, but that was the basis of the custom that I will come back to of staying up all night on Shavuot evening studying. Let's talk about the basic observances. So Shavuot is like all the other holidays. It's 2 days because we live outside the land of Israel. First day is the biblically ordained day. The second day is the rabbinic addition. No work is supposed to take place on the holiday except for those things necessary for cooking of food, just like on Passover and Sukkot, Ochel Nefesh. But otherwise, we are not supposed to be involved in the workday world. Because we're supposed to count 7 complete weeks, the week is not complete until after nightfall, right? Because the next day, when does the next day actually begin? It's when the stars come out, that's when clearly you're on the next day. So we are not supposed to start the evening of Shavuot, the first night, just like in the first Passover night. We traditionally didn't start it early because you wanted to have all 49 complete days of the Omer. And there's a kiddush, 2 loaves of bread, a festive meal. Now, one of the things that is unusual about Shavuot is that it became associated with a dairy meal. Again, where that comes from is not 100% clear. One explanation is because before they had the Torah, they could eat animals with no problems, but now that the Torah was given, they didn't know all the rules and regulations for kashrut of slaughtering the animals. All they could have was dairy on Shavuot. Another more practical reason might be because it's early spring time, and animals give birth. When animals give birth, there's a lot of milk available. And even if they slaughter the lambs or slaughter the young goats, the females still have milk available that can be milked by the farmers. So milk was very plentiful at that period of time, what have you. And I always what I grew up with and what I did was you just have dairy meals. Nothing wrong with that. Just have a nice dairy meal, something fancy, not the kosher version of Kraft macaroni and cheese, which my children and grandchildren have always loved and devoured. But again, a fancy meal. Now, it says in the Talmud, not in reference to this holiday, but it says in the Talmud that Ein Simcha Ela B'Basar V'Yayin. There's no real joy, no real celebration without having meat and wine. Right? And so some very strict say, how can you have a Yom Tov meal if you don't have meat? But then on the other hand, there's this tradition of having dairy. So what's the solution? Solution is you start off with a dairy meal or a dairy plate, a hors d'oeuvre first, a Vorspeise, and move away, take the dishes away, rinse your mouth out, maybe have a little swig of wine or something a little stronger to clean out the mouth, and then you have a meat meal. And remember, because you don't have to wait a long time after dairy unless it's a very hard cheese. And so my eldest son, as is his wont to follow that tradition, that's what they do. They have maybe some cheese blintzes. I don't know what they necessarily have for their hors d'oeuvre. And then they go on to have the regular kind of holiday meal that they would have. In the synagogue, the services in the morning are normal holiday services with Hallel, with Musaf. The Torah reading for the first day is the giving of the 10 Commandments. And when we read, just like we did when we read in Exodus about the giving of the 10 Commandments, and we'll read it again in Deuteronomy, it's done with a special trope. It's different from the way it's written standard-wise in the Chumash. There's a widespread tradition to stand for when you read that aliyah about the giving of the 10 Commandments. There's a tradition to decorate the synagogue with flowers and greenery and what have you, celebrating the spring season as part of that. And so the second day of Shavuot, just like the first, of course, we don't read Torah reading is not the 10 Commandments the second day, but the special reading for the second day. Also, in the traditional synagogue, there's a special poem, a piyut called Akdamot, which basically means prologue. Before I start reading the story of the giving of the 10 Commandments, I'm going to tell you this whole thing. All right, and it's all in Aramaic, and most people don't understand any of it, to be honest with you. Originally, it seems it was done. The Kohen has the first aliyah, it's called up the Torah. The Kohen says the bracha, the blessing, and then they recited Akdamot. Most of the authorities thought that was not right. It was an interruption between the blessing and the reading of the Torah. So those congregations that still follow the tradition of the Akdamot will say the Akdamot, and then the Kohen will say the blessing for the first aliyah. Okay. There's also a piyut, but that's rarely done in most congregations for the second day of the holiday, what have you. All right, so that's Shavuot, which is the middle of the three festivals, right? In the Torah, when we count the holidays, the Shalosh Regalim, the three pilgrimage festivals, it always starts with Pesach, Passover. Shavuot, Pentecost, if you want a nice English name for it, and Sukkot. Okay. Now, also on all of the regalim, there is a tradition to read one of the Megillot. Now we know, if you may remember, we talked about on Passover, we read the Megillah of Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs. Okay. Shavuot is the book of Ruth, Megillat Ruth, and we're going to spend most of the rest of the evening talking about Megillat Ruth because I like to do that. You're stuck with listening to me. Then on Sukkot, we have the reading of Ecclesiastes. Now that leaves two more Megillot. Megillot Eicha, Lamentations, is read on the 9th of Av, which comes in the summertime, and Megillat Esther is read on Purim. So all 5 Megillot are read. What's different about Pesach and Sukkot, they're 7 days. Basic holiday is 7 days. So there's almost always a Shabbat is available. And so the Megillah of Shir Hashirim is usually done on the Shabbat of the intermediate days of Passover. Ecclesiastes is read on the Shabbat of the intermediate days of Sukkot. But Shavuot is only 2 days. Biblically, it was only 1 day. So the Megillat Ruth, is read on the first day of Shavuot. So, and that goes, is universally followed that way. Now, a little bit of an introduction. We don't know for sure when Megillat Ruth was written and by whom it's written. The rabbinic tradition tries to associate all the books with figures that are mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. So the Lamentations is associated with the prophet Jeremiah, who lived at the time of the destruction. A Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes are associated with King Solomon. Esther is associated with Esther and Mordechai. So who is Megillat Ruth? The Talmud suggested it was the prophet Samuel, because the story of Ruth is the story that takes place during the time of the judges. In other words, between the time of the death of Joshua up to the story of Samuel and coming to the reign of King Saul and then King David. So who's the likely suspect to be the author? So the Talmud assumes is the prophet Shmuel, Samuel. Modern critics reject that identification, which is not unusual. And they argue as to when it was composed. Some say within a couple hundred years of the time of King David. Some want to say it's later on. Again, there's no way of knowing. There are a couple of important elements to it as well that tell us something about it. First of all, the historical understanding of it is Ruth is an ancestor of what king? David. Okay. And as we're going to see, she was a Moabite. And what does the Torah say about Moab converting to Judaism? It's a no-no. The Moabites were not nice to Israel when they came out of Egypt. They didn't greet them. They didn't show them chesed, kindness. And so the Torah says a Moabite can never convert to Judaism. Well, that creates a problem right at the front, because where Ruth is a Moabite. Okay. Number two, the book of Ezra speaks about Ezra coming back from exile. And when he comes to the land of Judea at that time under the Persian rule, there were a lot of Jewish leaders who had non-Jewish wives. And that created a commotion and a whole to-do. And Ezra tries to get them to divorce their non-Jewish wives and send away their non-Jewish children. The story of Ruth is to say, look, you can have converts to Judaism. They can be an element of the community. Now, if you put all these things together, you've got the problem that a Moabite is not supposed to convert to Judaism. You have a legend, a tradition, what have you, that David's ancestress, I guess that was a feminine way of saying it, his female ancestor was of Moabite heritage. So that could be a bad thing, right? You're David, you think you're worthy to be king of the Israelites. Your mother was this terrible tribal group. Okay? And some suggest that the book of Ruth was written taking that into consideration, but turning it on its head. Saying not that it is a disgraceful thing, but as we see when we go through the book, it's held up as being a sign of greatness. Because Ruth is a paragon of chesed, of loving kindness. Indeed, the theme of the book of Ruth can be said to be chesed, kindness. I don't want to use the word grace. Grace has a very Christian overtone to it, but it means you care for somebody even if it's not obligatory. Okay? So to take care of one part of the problem, the rabbis, at least in later rabbinic tradition, said it says Moavi and not Moaviyah. A Moabite man may not convert to Judaism, but a Moabite woman could. So that was their way of eliminating the problem. It doesn't answer the real question, which is never really answered, is when did Ruth convert? Who was her bet then? What class did she attend with some rabbi sitting around the table with them saying, you have to learn these things and then pass the test and then go to the mikveh or whatever? All right. So let's take a look and see what we can see in Megillat Ruth and gain from that. I knew it was going to be what this is. Turn the page. Job. Song of Songs. Oops, went too far. Ruth. By the way, the 5 Megillot, remember I said the holidays begin with Passover? So the 5 Megillot start with Shir HaShirim, which is for Passover, then Ruth, then Lamentations, then Ecclesiastes, and then Esther, following that calendar. Okay. So Ruth begins with the following: Vayehi b'mei Shvot HaShoftim. It was in the days of when they translate Shofet here as chieftains. In the Shoftim, remember we talked about the book of Shoftim, book of Judges. It is a better way of understanding it to translate it not as judges, but a title of leadership. If you want to say chieftains, it's a nice way of looking at it. There's a Talmudic tradition that whenever a book of the Bible begins with the words Vayehi, right, which it was in the days of Vayehi b'mei something, it always tells you something bad's going to happen. Right? So that Vayehi, it tells us something no good is about to take place. So it says in the days when the chieftains ruled, there was a famine. So now you know what's a bad thing. There's a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah, with his wife and 2 sons, went to reside in the country of Moab. So it opens up by telling us, 1, there's a famine, and 2, an unnamed, he's going to be named in a minute, individual leaves town. Okay? He leaves with his wife and sons, which is a mark against him for abandoning his people. And where does he abandon them to? To Moab, that dirty place, and no good country, with all the Moabites living there. Okay? Yeah. 1741, maybe? No, mine's got the Hebrew and English, so maybe. It's after Job, and then comes Psalms, Job, Song of Songs, and then Ruth. All right? So the man's name was Elimelech. God is king. My God is king. Names are important. His wife's name was Naomi. Naomi means pleasant, nice. And his sons were named Machlon and Chilion, which means disease and destruction. Okay. All right. Ephrates of Bethlehem in Judah. So this Ephraite is not clear what that comes from, but they live in Bethlehem in Judah, Beit Lechem, which of course is, who else is born later in Beit Lechem? David. And of course, that's why Jesus has to be born in Bethlehem in the New Testament, so that he fits in with that lineage. Okay. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. Okay. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. So, Elimelech, goodbye. You're written off. Your short period of time in the story is eliminated. Goodbye. Get lost. We don't want to do anything with you anymore. Okay. So she's left a widow with 2 sons. What's she supposed to do? Right? They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And Orpah, by the way, has a meaning in the back of the neck. You know, Oref is the back of your neck. All right. And I say the names are all meaningful. And they lived there about 10 years. Then those 2, Machlon and Chilion, also died. And so the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. Okay, in the ancient world, be a widow is bad enough. To have your sons go bye-bye as well, and to have 2 daughters-in-law to deal with, and apparently they were childless, which is also a question in rabbinic. The rabbinic tradition says if you don't have children in 10 years, you're supposed to get remarried, or at least take a second wife, what have you. All right. So what's she going to do? She started out with her 2 daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For in the country of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and given them food. Okay, so things had gotten good back home. She says, all right, let's go home. Accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. Okay, so these 3 ladies are on the road. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, turn back, each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband. Okay, so she says, look, girls, go home. God willing, you'll get married, you'll have a new husband, you'll have security, and everything go well with you. Okay? And she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. Now, no, they do use language, your people. We will return with you to your people. They were married to 2 nice Jewish boys. There's no mention of any conversion. Right? That's silent in here. And there is open question as to how they identify. Well, they don't identify with her people at this point. I said, but they're nice girls. They want to go back with her. But Naomi replied, turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you on their account debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours. The hand of the Lord has struck out against me. So she makes reference to the concept of levirate marriage. We read in the Torah, if a man dies without offspring, his brother, living brother, is supposed to marry her to have children in his name. So she starts off by saying, look, I don't have any more sons. Furthermore, if I got married tonight and I got pregnant right away, that's going to be at least a good 13 years before you're going to have a spouse. Why should you wait so long for that? Right? Now, remember back with the story of Judah and Tamar. Judah has 3 sons, but 2 of them die. Judah doesn't want his youngest to marry this Tamar. She's a black widow, right? And sends her away. And then she tricks him. He has relations with her, and she has has children. We'll see that at the end of the show. I apologize. I have to step out for a minute.
It was the traffic that was killer. The killer. Parking lot. Bumper to bumper all the way down. Baby.
That's what I say. There's this late evening stay off the highway.
I know they
We would have been better off if we would have stayed off the highway at the outset. Because I knew the traffic was like, I'm driven at this time of day. It's not, it's always busy.
Yeah,
Rush hour extends into like 8
I
o'clock.
was on the 401 and I got out.
Was it?
I went to the Shepherd, but Shepherd was one lane
Mhm.
construction.
Mhm.
It was not really any better.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Inside was black, soft, and then it was one lane. Bumper to bumper. But I got here in time anyway.
I used to deliver in that area, so I knew we got to know it pretty well. In the area leading up to here.
Mhm,
That was my route. Or part of my route. One of the many routes I had.
mhm.
Always. And I used to work at this time of night. I knew what it was like.
Yeah, I navigated quite a bit of traffic this afternoon, evening. It's unusual for me.
Sorry about that. Okay. So Naomi says, there's nothing here for you. So they broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah turns her back on her. That's why it's the back of the neck. Orpah, thus, is clearly symbolic there. And I'll come back to this in a minute. And but Ruth clung to her, so she said, Naomi, see, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. All right, so the implication being perhaps that until then, she didn't worship those gods. Right? So that's some want to see that as indication they had accepted Judaism, as it was known then. Go follow your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you to turn back and not follow you. And here comes one of the most famous passages in the entire Bible. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her, and the two went on until they reached Bethlehem. So Ruth says, I want to go with you. I'm joining you totally. Your people, your God, everything, I identify with that. So while there may be no clear indication of a formal conversion to Judaism, clearly this is an exemplar of what it means to convert to Judaism. Right? She takes upon herself the totality of being a Jew. Right? This is how in the Talmud the rabbis say you're not supposed to just automatically accept a convert. You're supposed to turn them away, even 3 times is this traditional understanding of it. And if they still insist, you say, what do you want this for? Don't you see how ill-treated the Jewish people are? How they suffer, those are all these things. And they say, no, nonetheless, I want it, you take them to the mikveh. No classes, no anything. That develops later on. But the point being, this serves as an example of what is meant in all the ways. The rabbis, as their wont in the Midrash, tried to build up since it was a man of Bethlehem, Ish means somebody of importance. So Elimelech must have been important. And his sons wouldn't marry just any ordinary girls. So these were daughters of the king of Moab. And Orpah, who ends up turning her back on them, she's not so nasty. She's not mean. She just accepts her mother-in-law's advice. So because she didn't go with Naomi all the way, she goes back and eventually she gives rise to Goliath, who shows up later on, and David kills Goliath. And so they meet again on the battlefield. Okay, because Ruth, the ancestor of David, goes back. Okay. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole city buzzed with excitement over them. The women said, can this be Naomi? They're looking at here's this lady left. She was this wealthy woman, a man of her husband had lots of money. Do not call me Naomi, she replied. Call me Mara, bitter. All right, her name is Naomi, pleasant. And so she says, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. For Shaddai, the Almighty, has made my lot very bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. How can you call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, when Shaddai has brought misfortune upon me? Now, also, one of the elements that we find in the story is this idea of completeness, fullness versus emptiness. Naomi's family under Elimelech leaves at a time of famine. The famine is, emptiness. There's no food. But obviously they were okay. They went to Moab where I guess they were full. But in Moab, they become empty. all the men died. And now she's returning to Bethlehem, where things now have gotten better because the famine is gone and people are able to eat and what have you. And she's coming back penniless, empty, except for one thing. Thus Naomi returned from the country of Moab. She returned with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabite. Now, the Megillat Ruth, the book of Ruth, wants you to remember that she's a Moabite. In case you didn't know that already, because we were told that earlier, it tells us Ruth the Moabite. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, which was the day after Pesach, right? Okay, end of the first chapter. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a man of substance of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Ruth, the Moabite, in case you forgot she was a Moabite, reminds us here, Ruth the Moabite, said to Naomi, I would like to go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain behind someone who may show me kindness. Now, if you remember, read in the Torah, that there are several rules of harvesting. When a farmer harvests his crops, they have to leave the corner of the field unharvested. If they drop a little bit of grain, an ear of grain as they're going by, they have to leave it behind. And after they made sheaves of grain, if they leave one sheaf behind in the field, they can't go back and get it. And the poor come after them and get it. All right, they glean. Right? This was in Europe too. There's a famous, I forgot which artist, shows the women gleaning in the fields. All right. So Ruth says, I want to go and glean, but somebody who will be kind to me. Okay, because here she's a foreigner, a woman without any protection, and in the ancient world, that was not a good thing to be. Yes, daughter, go, she replied, and off she went. She came and gleaned in a field behind the reapers, and as luck would have it, just by chance, my goodness, how could you expect that? It was a piece of land belonging to Boaz, who was Elimelech's family. All right, so we already see the hand of God working here behind the scenes a little bit. Presently, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. So obviously, Boaz doesn't have to be out in the fields harvesting. He must be a wealthy man. And he's got his farmers, his sharecroppers, whatever, they're doing the work. And he comes out, he's going to join them, but he says, he greeted the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they responded, the Lord bless you. And Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose girl is that? He sees Ruth over there. He says, who does she belong to? She must be married. Who's her husband? Who's her father? Whatever. The servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is a Moabite girl. In case you forgot she was from Moab, they want to let you know that she's Moabite. I'll keep reminding you of that in case you miss it. She is a Moabite girl who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. So she even asked permission to do what an ordinary Jew was allowed to do by the Torah law. She has been on her feet ever since she came this morning. She has rested but a little in the hut. So she's been working very hard. Boaz said to Ruth, listen to me, daughter, which is just an expression of an elder to somebody younger. How much older is a good question. Don't go to glean in another field. Don't go elsewhere, but stay here close to my girls. Keep your eyes on the field they are reaping and follow them. I have ordered the men not to molest you. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink some of the water that the men have drawn. So he says, stay here, glean here. I ordered the men, leave her alone. Don't play, no games, no nasty stuff with her. And if you get thirsty, you're allowed to drink the water they brought from the well. She prostrated herself with the face to the ground and said to him, why are you so kind as to single me out when I am a foreigner? Boaz said in reply, I've been told of all that you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in the land of your birth and came to a people you have not known before. May the Lord reward your deeds. May you have a full recompense from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge. Okay, so we see here again this element. Ruth says to Naomi, hopefully I'll find a place I can reap with somebody, be kind. Boaz is kind to her. She says, why are you being kind to me? He says, basically, I'm paying you back. You were kind. I'm going to be kind. All right. You showed chesed. I'm going to show chesed. Mm-hmm. And he also under his wings. The expression tachak kanfei hashchinat, under the wings of the divine presence, is used. And when a person converts to Judaism, they enter tachak kanfei, under the wings of God. She answered, you are most kind, my lord, to comfort me, and to speak gently to your maidservant, though I am not so much as one of your maidservants. Right? So things are nice. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here and partake of the meal and dip your morsel in the vinegar. So she sat down beside the reapers. He handed her roasted grain and she ate her fill and had some left over. So he shares lunch with her, or whatever it is. When she got up again to glean, Boaz gave orders to his workers. You're not only to let her glean among the sheaves without interference, but you must also pull some stalks out of the heaps and leave them for her to glean and not scold her. Right? He says, sneak a little lecture to her. She gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned. It was about an ephah of barley, which is a substantial amount of grain, and carried it on her back with her to the town. When her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and when she also took out and gave her what she had left over after eating her fill, she had a doggy bag for her mother-in-law. They call it doggy bags. Her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be he who took such generous notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law whom she had worked with, saying, the name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord who has not failed in his kindness to the living or to the dead. For Naomi explained to her daughter-in-law, the man is related to us. He is one of our redeeming kinsmen. By law of the Torah, if a man dies without heirs, which was the case of Elimelech, when his sons died, there's no heirs left to the estate. The wife doesn't inherit the estate. Other relatives inherit the estate, those closest to him. So he's one of those kinsmen who have inheritance rights to the property. And we'll see that figures in with Ruth later in a minute. You want to read? Okay, next verse. Ruth, the Moabite, in case you forgot, said, he even told me, stay close by my workers until all my harvest is finished. And Naomi answered her daughter-in-law, Ruth, it is best, daughter, that you go out with his girls and not be annoyed in some other field. So she stayed close to the maidservants of Boaz and gleaned until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest were finished. Then she stayed at home with her mother-in-law. So she went through the process of gathering the grains that they were able to store away and they would have for the future. Chapter 3. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, daughter, I must seek a home for you where you may be happy. After all, got to get married. Don't want to be a spinster. I don't want my daughter to be without marriage. Now, there is our kinsman Boaz, whose girls you are close to. He will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor tonight. So bathe, anoint yourself, dress up, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not disclose yourself to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Okay, he says, get all dobbed up, to the nines. What's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, dolled up.
In a nice way.
In a nice way.
Modest way.
Well, that's an interesting. I'm glad you said that because I'll come to that in a moment. When he lies down, note the place where he lies down and go over and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what you are to do. She replied, I will do everything you tell me. Okay, so she tells her, go take a bath, put on your makeup, put on your good dress, go down there, and when he goes to sleep, sneak over there and uncover his feet. Now, there's some question is what does that really mean? Is it feet, or is there an entendre there to referring to genitalia? You know, traditional commentaries avoid that, but some of the modern commentaries suggest that that was not that they necessarily did anything, but that was a message. Okay. All right. So now she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. Now, her mother-in-law had told her what? Bathe. Let me find it here. Bathe, anoint yourself, dress up, and go down to the threshing floor. The last thing on the list was to go down to the threshing floor. Ruth reverses it. She goes down to the threshing floor, then she does what her mother-in-law told her, i.e., she didn't want to go dolled up down there because people might get the wrong idea. You were saying modesty, she's being very modest. Okay, so Boaz ate and drank, and they're celebrating, so I'm sure he had a little bit extra. And as it says, in a cheerful mood, went to lie down beside the grain pile. Then she went over stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, the man gave a start, pulled up, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Okay, so whatever she uncovered, he woke up in the middle of the night seeing something's uncovered. And there's this girl here. Who are you? He asked. And she replied, I am your handmaid Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeeming kinsman. In other words, take me as a wife, because you have the right of levirate marriage. Clearly, the earlier historical idea implies, just like we have with the story of Judah, that the earliest understanding of levirate marriage extended far beyond simply the brothers of the deceased. Okay? He exclaimed, be blessed of the Lord, daughter. Your latest deed of loyalty is greater than the first, in that you have not turned to younger men, whether poor or rich. He says, you could have gone to some nice young guy, which tells you that there must be a big age difference. And you went after me. I will do in your behalf whatever you ask. For all the elders of my town know what a fine woman you are. But while it is true I am a redeeming kinsman, there is another redeemer closer than I. There's somebody else whose kinship is a little bit closer. So he gets first crack at redemption. Stay for the night. Then in the morning, if he will act as a redeemer, good, let him redeem. But if he does not want to act as redeemer for you, I will do so myself, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until dawn. And therefore, that's why the implication is not there was no hanky-panky between them. She rose before one person could distinguish another, for he thought, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Preserve her modesty. And he said, hold out the shawl you are wearing. She held it while he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. He gave her a lot to schlep back to the home. When she got back to the town, she came to her mother-in-law, who asked, how is it with you, daughter? She told her all that the man had done for her. And she added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying to me, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. And Naomi said, stay here, daughter, till you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Meanwhile, in the back of the farm, Boaz had gone to the gate and sat down there. In ancient, not just ancient Israel, we know this from many archaeological digs, that business, important matters were often conducted at the gates of a city. They would gather there to conduct business, to conduct court, whatever it might be. And there was sometimes we found in archaeological remains benches that were by the city gates. All right? So Boaz had gone to the gate and sat down there. And now the Redeemer, whom Boaz had mentioned, passed by. He called, come over and sit down here, Ploni Elmoni. Ploni Almoni, and he came over and sat down. Now there's a tradition borne out by later usage that Ploni Almoni is like John Doe. If you want to say I saw somebody, I just saw someone, it's Ploni Almoni. It's just a person. It's John Doe. So the most of the traditional commentaries assume that that's not his name. But because, as we see from the story goes, he didn't want to act to redeem Ruth, he's written out of history. He's got to be there, but we don't need to tell you who he is. Ploni Almoni. Then Boaz took 10 elders of the town and said, "Be seated here." And they sat down. So he makes a court of 10, which is another question, but he's got a minion, however you want to look at it. And they sat down. And he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, now returned from the country of Moab, must sell the piece of land which belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. I thought I would disclose the matter to you and say, acquire it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you are willing to redeem it, redeem. But if you will not redeem, tell me that I may know, for there's no one to redeem but you, and I come after you." Okay, so this is the deal. You have the right to redeem. I'm the only one left after you. So he says, "I'm willing to redeem it," he replied. Boaz continued. By the way, when you acquire the property from Naomi and from Ruth, the Moabite, just to remind you that she's a Moabite, you must also acquire the wife of the deceased, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate. Why isn't Ploni Almoni's name mentioned? Because he doesn't want to do that. So since he doesn't want to maintain the name of the deceased, his name is erased. The Redeemer replied, "Then I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own estate. You take over my right of redemption, for I am unable to exercise it." For he apparently doesn't know, what Boaz knows, that the law is that a Moabite man may not enter into the household of Israel, but a Moabite woman may. So he says, "I don't want or he says, maybe he's saying, I can't trust her. She's already lost a husband. Maybe it's not good luck." All right. Now, this was formerly done in Israel in cases of redemption or exchange. Now, this tells you that when this story right now is written, this is no longer the way it was done. It's telling us something that was no longer done. At whatever period of history the book of Ruth was actually written, what now follows was no longer the normative way of doing things. Okay, so now it's formally done in Israel in cases of redemption or exchange. To validate any transaction, one man would take off his sandal and hand it to the other. Such was the practice in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Acquire for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Nobody knows who took whose sandal off. That's not clear. And Boaz said to the elders and to the rest of the people, "You are witnesses today that I am acquiring from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Machlon. I am also acquiring Ruth, the Moabite, wife of Machlon, as my wife, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate, that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today." Okay, so it's all confirmed. All the people, the gate, and the elders answered, "We are. May the Lord make women who is the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel. Prosper in Ephrath and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman." So, as I said at the beginning, Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Jacob, loses 2 husbands, tricks Jacob into impregnating her, and gives rise to Perez. I forgot the other name. You'll mention it in a minute. The two sons.
Zahar?
What?
Zahar? Is it Zahar? Started with the-
No, no, no.
Perez and.
Phyllis.
I don't know.
Gonna kill me now.
I'll find it later if necessary. All right. So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife, and he cohabited with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. All right, so she got pregnant. The rabbis, one of the issues in the whole levirate marriage scheme of things is that the Torah commands this practice, okay, that a man has to marry the widow of his brother if they have no offspring. But it's very clear the rabbis are extremely uncomfortable with it. The Torah says a man is not supposed to marry the wife of his brother. If a brother divorces his wife, a man can't marry her. So the rabbi said that you have to marry her only because you're fulfilling the mitzvah. If you had interest in her before, you really shouldn't do it. So the rabbis, in order to make this fit, say Boaz married her, they had a night together, and then he dies. Happy, I hope, but anyways, he dies with the child. So it was done out of kindness, not out of any lust for her. That's all filling in blanks. It's nothing here that talks about that. Okay. All right.
Boaz dies.
Well, according to rabbinic tradition, Boaz dies right away because he fulfills the mitzvah of Yibum, and he's done his job, and so goodbye. It's playing on this idea that they're not completely comfortable. There has to be the right reasons for doing it. That's at least an explanation of the Midrash, but take it or leave it. You don't have to accept it either way. All right. So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife. He cohabited with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not withheld a redeemer from you today." She's become center stage now. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain your old age, for he is born of your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. Okay? She's better than 7 sons would be to you. So Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom. She became its foster mother, and the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, "A son is born to Naomi." So she's taking center stage. So we have Naomi at the beginning, Ruth in the middle, and then we turn back to Naomi. The women neighbors gave him a name, saying, "A son is born to Naomi." They named him Oved, O-B-E-D, which means servant, to serve. Obed, he was the father of Jesse, father of David. This is the line of Perez. Perez begot Chetzron, Chetzron begot Ram, Ram begot Aminadab, Aminadab begot Nachshon, Nachshon begot Salmon, Salmon begot Boaz, Boaz begot Oved, Oved begot Jesse, Ishai, and Ishai begot David. End of the book of Ruth. So in a very short book, just 4 chapters, we emphasize that chesed, loving kindness, is an extremely important element. When we read the story about the servant of Abraham looking for a wife for Isaac, how does he determine who would be the right one? By making sure that she's kind. She draws water for him and everybody else. We see that this is an important element in what's to be there. And this idea of chesed, loving kindness, of being generous to people, runs through the entire book. It tells us also that, frankly, there's nothing wrong with a convert in your lineage. Because we have David, King David, who is the exemplar of the king, despite all his feet of clay, the Mashiach. He ultimately descends from Ruth, who constantly was called a Moabite, to remind you that that's the reality there. And perhaps it was meant as an insult originally. Look at this David, he thinks he's something. He's really descended from this Ruth the Moabite, into a title that makes it honorific. She was a Moabite, but look how she was. As a paragon and a paradigm of chesed, of loving kindness. The other day, I was listening to one of these recordings that they listen to about Jewish law, and in part of it, it was talking about, there's this famous letter that Maimonides wrote to Avadia the Ger. Avadia, knows the name Oved, servant, Avadia, servant of God. Abdullah, by the way, the Arabic name means servant of God. Same thing. Eved Abdullah is Eved Allah. Abdullah. All right? So anyway, so Avadia the Ger writes this letter to Maimonides, and he's basically lamenting that people don't treat him properly. They don't want him to say in praying, Eloheinu v'Elahei Avoteinu, our God and God of our ancestors. It's not his ancestor, and other things like that. And Maimonides writes back to him, telling him they're wrong. He is, at least philosophically, religiously, a descendant of Abraham. Anytime it says anything about the ancestry, he can include himself in it. Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, who's commanded us by his sanctified commandments, and commanded us. Us includes anyone who comes tachat kanfei hashchina, under the wings of the divine presence. So Ruth clearly serves as that paradigm. And not only that, even going further back, we see in the story, it harkens back to the story of Tamar, who was willing to push to fulfill what needed to be done, even though it was kind of a brazen act on her part. And when push came to shove, when her life was threatened, right, she was going to be burned, she refused to embarrass Judah by saying he was the father, but by sending him a message to let him know that he should know that's the case and leave it to him. In which it elsewhere says in the Talmud, you should be prepared to die rather than embarrass somebody else in public. And that's another, she's in that line throughout down to Boaz, and then ultimately to David. So there are these messages that are found in the book of Ruth, which, while it's a seemingly simple pastoral story, everybody lives happily ever after, despite what the rabbi said for Elimelech, Boaz dying shortly afterwards, that there's a lot more in it. Now, furthermore, why is it associated with Shavuot? Maybe the agricultural aspect of it, but also it's been suggested that when Israel receives the Torah at Sinai, that becomes an act of conversion for the entire Jewish people. They have to prepare themselves. They have to go to the mikveh. They accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven, O Malchut Shemayim. When a person, and before they left Egypt, if they hadn't been circumcised, they were circumcised for the Pesach. So those three elements of circumcision, acceptance of mitzvot, and mikveh all take place in the story of receiving the Torah at Sinai, which takes place according to rabbinic chronology on the holiday of Shavuot. So the book of Ruth exemplifies that very concept of somebody coming under the divine presence. In the case of Ruth, it's also the major and most important figures are two women. It's the one book in the Bible where it's a woman, two women take center stage. You have this sort of the lover of King Solomon in the Song of Songs, but there's no real personality there. But here you have Ruth and Naomi who take center stage. The men are really secondary to them. So it has significance on that level as well. Okay. So one thing I mentioned, Lag BaOmer, which is coming up shortly. You can go out and build bonfires and all those sort of things. Next week, don't forget, and I'm going to send it out again, but people don't always read my emails or don't take them to heart. But we will not meet here next week. Anybody who comes here next week to come to class, you're in the wrong place. We will meet at the mikveh. I will send out information maybe even tonight or at least tomorrow, giving you all the details about where we're going to meet. Okay? Any questions? Any complaints? If you have
No
complaints,
complaints. No complaints.
Okay. All right, everybody. I'll say good night and be well.